Hey, welcome back everyone to another real estate podcast. My name is Essen Reza from Century 21 Innovative Realty. And today I've got a special guest on the show, Mr. Cosme Reveredo from Equiton, who is a senior associate with the company. Thanks so much for coming on, man.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here, man. I'm happy to be here. It's a nice sunny day.
It's amazing, yeah.
Finally get some sun. It's been a tough weekend. But
absolutely,
nice
absolutely. Hopefully no more snowstorms. That's the last
every time I say that, we end up getting a snowstorm, so I'm not going to say it.
100%. We're in the mid-March, so I think one or two more is bound to come, but let's see. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, man. But thanks so much, man. Today's episode is going to be a special one because, I get clients all the time asking me about investments into real estate. Yeah. And one of the common objections that I get from them is I don't have enough money for a down payment. I'm not getting a mortgage. I'm not qualifying, especially in these high rate environments. Yep. It's very, very common. So we'll talk about that, how Equiton is going to help serve those clients who aren't able to qualify.
Sure.
But before we do that, tell us a bit about yourself, how you got started, even your real estate background, how you got into Equiton.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a finance background. So out of university was really my first exposure to real estate. I was working at a hardware store actually part-time. And I was, working with a colleague of mine who was just telling me about his student rental portfolio. And he was sort of living, life on his terms. You'd only work maybe a couple of days a week. And I thought to myself, hey, how are you getting by like this? Yeah. And then he told me about a student rental portfolio, and me being a student at the time obviously piqued my interest. So I started, just started digging into ways where I can invest into real estate at that young age, obviously. Started with conventional real estate, right? Your typical, investment and rental properties, for example. Over time, though, and if I'm being honest, over the last few years, I've sort of transitioned more over to some of the private forms of investment, right? More passive forms of investment. So specifically land development offerings, investing in land developments, as well as private lending, right? I'm sure you're familiar and your viewers are familiar with private lending. So I've been doing more of that. And if I'm being more honest, it's been more beneficial in the terms of yield, right? Like over the last few years, I've actually seen a higher yield going through some of those passive forms versus actually, your traditional conventional real estate investing, right? So that's really where I am. I joined Equiton because I've been in this private investment space for the last 4 years now. Obviously, Equiton is an emerging company. They've been doing fairly well. The company itself has grown considerably since the last time I spoke with them. They started in 2015 to this point now. They're over 150 employees, I believe. Oh, nice. And in terms of sort of the assets under management, you're nearing into almost $1 billion in assets under management. So they're on a very strong trajectory.
Yeah. And it's funny because when I spoke to Jas, when we first started doing these podcasts, one of the very first guests or companies he asked me to invite on was Equiton. And he kept pressing it. And I wasn't familiar with the space because for me, all I know was brick and mortar real estate, right? So that's the traditional way of investing. Until just a month ago when he said, you got to have them on. And I said, okay, let's have them on. And this past week, I did like a deep dive into videos about Equiton. I saw, one of your associates, Lawrence, who's the associate vice president there.
Yeah, we'd like to call him the face of Equiton.
The face of Equiton. and basically, when I was hearing what he was saying, I'm like, how come I didn't come across this sooner? Yeah. Right.
And to be fair, Essen, this space wasn't largely available to the everyday investor in the past. I mean, quite honestly, here in Ontario, up until 2016, I would say this space was only really available to your high net worth, top 1% investors, your institutional level investors, endowment funds, pension funds, right? So these are high level, high net worth investors. It wasn't truly accessible or even available to the everyday investor. But since 2016, some of the rules changed within Ontario with respect to eligibility, right? And now that, everyday investor can participate in these investments. But to your point, it takes, understanding and the exposure to them to truly understand and get involved, right? And that's really, what you're doing, which is great. With this webcast and for your your network as well. Yeah. Once they actually get exposure to it, then they'll understand sort of the benefits behind it.
Yeah. And kind of what caught my eye was one of the videos I was watching with Lawrence where he said, you can invest with just $5,000. Yeah. Which I was like, okay, that's clickbait. But when I listened to it, I'm like, okay, no, you actually can do that. Yeah. So we'll talk about the investments needed, but talk a little bit about Equiton. For those that are still unfamiliar with this idea, what is Equiton and what do you guys do to help clients?
That's a great question. To be honest, it's not immediately well known to what exactly Equiton is or who they are and what they provide, right? And it's a very common question that I get with my investors, right? So Equiton really, at our core, I like to say there's two things that we do at Equiton, right? First and foremost, at our core, we are real estate investors, right? As a firm, we were started by real estate investors for real estate investors, right? So at our core, we are real estate investors. But really, the second part of that, or the second element to that is we are asset managers as well, right? Okay. So the first part, we are investors in real estate. We aggregate capital from different sources, and then we deploy that capital into assets, right? Real estate assets. The second part of that being we are asset managers. We manage those assets, and we are truly involved in every element of the real estate life cycle from inception to the end, right? So what I like to call Equiton and what we call Equiton, we are a fully integrated operation at Equiton, really. So we help investors, build generational wealth through real estate passively. And I think that's really the key that folks will get out of this, because you mentioned, to your point earlier, there is a minimum investment of $5,000 that you can jump in and get involved in one of these offerings for a very low, relatively low investment amount, right? To that point, being that low, if you look at the environment today, right? If anyone's looking to invest in real estate, for example, what are some of your barriers, right? Number one, you need a higher down payment, correct? Here in Toronto and maybe the GTA in general, Greater Golden Horseshoe, et cetera, you may need upwards of $100,000 to $200,000 just to qualify to put a down payment on a property, right? Beyond that, let's just assume you get qualified. Will you be approved for a mortgage, right? That's a second element. Let's just assume you get accepted and approved for a mortgage. Will you be able to service that mortgage, right? And you can recognize in times like this, and your viewers can recognize, obviously, in an environment where interest rates are now increasing, we are hopefully at the last stage of increases. But again, over the last 13 months, we've seen a significant, almost 400 basis point increase, right? Can they service that mortgage, right? And then finally, and I think more importantly, it comes down to that property management. How many folks want to be a landlord and actively manage an investment property, right? The conversations that I have with a lot of my investors, it's just not an option for them. Whether or not, they just don't have the time, or they just may not be skilled at it, right? And really, when it comes to real estate investors, and you might know a few of them in your own network, some of them just fail simply because they just can't actively properly manage the property. And then they sort of get deterred about just investing in real estate as a whole, right? So here at Equiton, we give them at least an option to participate in real estate. So there's really no reason to not participate, because we've heard all of those reasons as well, why we can't participate. So we give you an option to participate. And on top of that, you get obviously returns that can help you build your wealth. Right. So
and that's a great point, because we were just talking off camera with another friend of mine today was, now with prices being so high in the GTA, like people have to get creative to purchase a home. So what we're pushing a lot these days is the joint venture strategy, where, 2 or 3 guys, and I have done this myself, you come together, you buy a property. But the problem with that is it works for a lot of people, but there's still people out there that are not comfortable partnering up with someone they may not know, or even someone they know. And when they do buy that property, being a landlord, it's not for everybody.
And to be honest, folks, like even these folks at joint venture, their life will change over time as they evolve. Different things, different priorities come to light. Will the priorities be the same with your joint venture partners? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Right. So again, a lot of things can get derailed in that form, right?
Absolutely. And so what I'm hearing is that Equiton allows someone who may be having these barriers to entry into the market, still gives them exposure to real estate, but they don't have to do the everyday management of that real estate.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That's exactly, I think in a nutshell, you've actually summarized that very well. That's exactly what it is.
So let's kind of dive into that and unpack that specifically. Now, when let's say I have $10,000 I want to invest in. I'm going to put it into a fund with Equiton. What kind of funds do you guys have? And what are the differences between the two?
Sure. So that's a good question. And we'll just take a step back, right? Because let's talk about the 2 types of investments that Equiton offers, right? So at Equiton, we offer 2 fundamental styles of investment. We've got what's called our funds, and then a direct investment into a land development offering. Okay. With respect to our funds, everyday investors such as yourself, myself, can share in some of those benefits that come with, traditional real estate ownership. So whether that's capital appreciation over time, whether that's, equity in the investment through the pay down of mortgages, or simply, and probably the most important for a lot of folks, cash flow, consistent cash flow on a monthly basis. They can share into each of those, benefits without obviously some of the drawbacks, at least, from owning investment properties or owning properties in general, right? So the way we structure our fund, we do have, our real estate residential income fund, which is a minimum $10,000, as you mentioned. Again, folks in that fund will be sharing in and investing in a fractional ownership of 32 apartment buildings largely across Ontario, with 2 buildings out in Edmonton, right? The fund consists of over 2,500 units. And again, they will receive a consistent 6% annualized return. Paid monthly in distributions, right? So that's your cash flowing element. But over time, the longer they spend in that fund, they will get an appreciation of their unit price over time, and they will recognize that appreciation when they go and liquidate their investment after 5 years, for example, and recognize that appreciation at the end. So the way we've sort of set up our funds here at Equiton, we wanted to mimic traditional real estate, right? So you get that capital appreciation, you get the cash flowing over time, and of course, over time, you will benefit from that drawdown on your lending or your mortgage, and the bill, and obviously the increase in your equity over time. So that's really, from a fundamental standpoint, the science or the mechanics behind our funds. With respect to the development offerings, it's typically, reserved for more of the savvier investor, right? It's a higher down payment with respect to our offerings at Equiton. It's a minimum $25,000 investment. So, typically a more savvy investor, but however, it also represents the largest profit at Equiton in terms of our investment. You can earn upwards of an annualized return of 20% now over a 5-year or more period. So in essence, you could actually double your money in 5 years, essentially, right? So again, it's more of a riskier investment in terms of, with respect to the difference between our funds and the developments, but it also helps generate the highest profit. Right. So, I know you being in the industry, you probably recognize that, from a pre-construction standpoint, we always like to pitch, pre-construction, get into the VIP phase, for example, and you're first person in and you take advantage of being one of the first people in the door. And that's not entirely true, right? I mean, ultimately, if you're investing in the land development, you truly are one of the first people in the door on an investment. You are sharing in the equity ownership and the profits of that development offering. And your exit plan as an investor is to sell to those, end users or pre-construction buyers. So you are truly the first person in the door in one of those investments. No,
and that's really cool, because that's the misconception that we always face, is that you're buying that first unit when that phase releases, but really
you might be one or two phases behind.
Exactly. And before that, there's a whole land development deal that Equiton serves that can serve you as an investment as well. So with the land equity, just so I understand, my audience understands, it's basically a real development. So it's like a condo development or a housing development that people like myself are going to invest $25,000, $50,000, and that's going to go towards that development. So can you give like an actual example of this process?
So right now we are building a mid-rise condominium in Toronto's East End by the Scarborough Bluffs. So it's important to know where we have our funds. They're a fund style investment. They're a little more diversified, right? Where you can, invest in a diverse and a fractional ownership across different assets. So whether it's our residential fund and you're investing in a fractional ownership of 32 buildings across Canada, largely Ontario, of course, and of course our income and development fund, which is, you're investing in a fractional ownership of different asset types within real estate. The development project is very different in the sense that you are investing directly into one development project at a specific time in a specific location, right? So with respect to our development project on the go right now, we do have a project, a mid-rise condominium, 12 stories, in the east end of Toronto by the Scarborough Bluffs. The top 4 floors of the building will actually have some unobstructed views, rather, of the Scarborough Bluffs. So if you recognize Scarborough Bluffs, the area, It's a very scenic area, of course.
I there a lot when I was young.
Yeah. So you get that lakefront living, right? Without having to pay that downtown condo lakefront prices, right? Which you'll recognize, right? So
absolutely.
That's sort of the project that we have on the go right now. It is a project that's, again, being done entirely in-house through Equiton. It's a fully integrated operation. And as you sort of referred to, an investor was coming in, it will be effectively investing into an equity portion on that development, and their profits will be driven, of course, by an exit strategy that is to sell the units at whatever phase, our sales phase, and selling those units, the profit that they generate, the spread between the sale price and obviously the cost to manufacture the unit is sort of what our investors will share.
Got it. Yeah. And then talk a little bit about, number one, the returns on that, and number two, what is the time frame that money is going to be in the investment? Can I pull that money out? Yeah. Or does it have to stay for a certain number of years?
Very good question. With our development projects, once you hand us the money today, unfortunately, you will have to tie up that money for the entirety of the project, right? So we are projecting a time horizon on this project between 5.5 years, right? So at the end of the 5.5 years rather, when the project is completed, when the keys are handed over to the end user, that's when our investors will typically recognize their profits. So the return of their capital plus their profits.
Right.
With respect to returns, our base case scenario projects that we will return between a 20% annualized return on the project, right? So the way I like to sort of position it for folks is over that 5 year or 5.5 year time horizon, you're essentially doubling your money in that period, right? So you start with 100,000. Over that 5 year period, you're likely walking away with 200,000, right? So, but again, it consists of a different risk profile. Yeah. So as long as the investor is confident and comfortable with that risk profile, which is why I sort of alluded to being more for a sophisticated level investor. Right. But if you even look at it and you take away and strip away the layers on it, you would know better than I would, of course, when you invest in a pre-construction condominium, for example, right now, you're paying more than $25,000 up until occupancy. Absolutely. Right? That's fair to say, correct? So if you were to, sort of take that out of the equation and you can only invest maybe $25,000 to $50,000 and not have to worry about going to occupancy and closing on a mortgage at that occupancy stage and still generating a profit, it may be a different viable alternative to actually owning a pre-construction unit, right? So that's sort of one way to sort of spin it and look at it, right?
Yeah, so, and it seems completely hands-off.
It's entirely hands-off.
Which I like a lot. And I think, along with people that own real estate, like it's not a bad idea to diversify and maybe mix and match a little bit. So you can still own brick and mortar real estate, but having a Equiton partner, an investment fund where you can actually, like you said, double your money. Yes, you have to keep it for 5 or 6 years, but those returns at the end of 5 or 6 years will definitely amount to something that maybe when you get that money back, now you can actually buy more real estate.
Potentially, with that perspective. Right? And to your earlier point, this doesn't necessarily have to be a one or the other scenario, right? Like I find a lot of our investors right now at Equiton, they view this as a complementary piece to their portfolio, right? Exactly. Where they can actually diversify themselves across the board, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be, well, I can only invest in one or the other.
For sure.
This is a complementary, it's considered an alternative investment, right? An alternative investment in real estate. It's effectively a complementary piece. And the one thing that we haven't even touched on, which I'm sure we will eventually, the folks get an opportunity to leverage your registered funds when they invest into these offerings. Yeah. And, a lot of my investors, they don't have really an idea sometimes of what to do with some of their registered funds. Got it. If they have the opportunity to actually leverage some of those registered funds, they're throwing their hands up in the air in celebration, right?
Right. So what you're saying is now we can use our RRSPs, RESPs, and actually invest into these funds. Yeah. Whereas if you invest it with the bank, you may not get the best interest, but with Equiton or a firm like yours, you may be able to make a lot more. So how does one activate the RRSPs and bring it to Equiton? Yeah. And RESPs as well, right? You said.
So every registered fund under the sun, with the exception of the registered disability plan. We cannot touch that one for different reasons, of course. Right. But actually to your, maybe let's take a step back. You mentioned public versus private. And we didn't necessarily touch on that. So, in the public market, you'll recognize, investing in a public market. If were investing in the public market last year, you've likely seen a lot of volatility, right? Yeah. Myself included, a lot of volatility in my holdings last year. In fact, my portfolio was down almost 20% last year, right? Invested in the public markets. And it's not that I'm investing in, anything, out of the ordinary. I'm investing in blue chip companies that still suffered through a lot of, volatility last year. And simply because the public market is largely driven by emotions, right? That's fair to say, right? So whereas our private market, which is where Equiton, obviously plays within, we are, largely driven by the fundamentals of the asset class within our portfolio, right? So in this case being real estate, right? So we don't suffer from a lot of that volatility. In fact, in our last year at Equiton, we had one of the best years in our fund. Nice. We provided one of our highest returns in our fund, simply because, again, we weren't necessarily affected or impacted by some of that volatility. So back to your point, to circle back to the registered funds, if someone's investing in a traditional mutual fund, for example, they've likely seen their portfolio take quite a bit of hit or just not increase in any value or appreciate in any value, right? So how do they get some of that and put some of that to use so that they can diversify their overall portfolio while still being included or invested into into an asset class rather, such as real estate, which they understand, may have a passion for, and really want to be involved in, but maybe just don't have that upfront capital that we spoke about earlier to actually invest in real estate, right? So that's a good alternative option and a complementary piece to investing in real estate.
Right. And just to follow up on that, so, when I promote real estate investments to my clients, one of the main objections that I get from them is, I can't afford it, or, I won't qualify, which you talked about. But, when you peel back the layers, when you ask them, the actual core objection, what is it? Their real fear is, what if I lose my money?
Sure.
And that's what it comes down to. So with your firm, Equiton, if someone has an objection, what are you telling the clients that, look, these are the risks involved, but this is what we do to mitigate those risks? How do you secure or safeguard that investment for the client so they feel comfortable moving forward?
Yeah. So, one of the largest risks when it comes to these private investments is liquidity. Okay. And to that point, like at Equiton, our investment funds, we typically require a soft 5-year holding period. Okay. For a couple of reasons. One, it's real estate. We don't view real estate as a short-term investment at Equiton, and quite frankly, no one should view real estate as a short-term investment, right? And it takes time to put that money to use, right? So at Equiton, we like to sometimes say that we value your time more than the money itself. So there is that soft 5-year holding period. It's soft in the sense that if you absolutely needed your money, Essen, and there's an emergency, we will honor some of those redemptions. They're subject to obviously some early redemption penalties, but we do at least upfront let folks know this is the case, right? And really, when it comes to liquidity, that's really the biggest risk, I would say, in terms of some of these private investments. You have to understand that sometimes, especially in a development offering, your money is tied up for a certain period. You have to be comfortable with that illiquidity, okay? Now, beyond that, in terms of the assets or underlying assets that roll into the fund, for an apartment fund, for example, to lose its valuation, something would have to happen catastrophically across the board to 32 different apartment buildings for it to lose its value, right? So, intuitively, it's hard to describe what would necessarily happen. Maybe an act of God of some sense, where the value of that fund would really, really crater, right? But beyond that, we do give our investors comfort in the sense from a governance and a transparency standpoint. We do provide them with quarterly reports that are audited. So we do provide audited financial statements from an external auditor so that they can review, some of the high level and even into the nitty gritty about our funds to ensure that, there is some support behind it. We are using the money for what we intend to use it for, and we're not obviously being malicious with it, right? So there are some safeguards in place for that, in that sense, yes.
For sure. And just to kind of follow up on your previous point about the economy, how it's volatile. With real estate and interest rates right now, obviously there's a lot of volatility with that at the moment. So how has Equiton sort of hedged that? And even with inflation, how is this investment, hedging inflation? And how are you guys, still performing with the returns despite values going down?
Yeah, so the value of our real estate in terms of our residential multifamily real estate is valued very differently than obviously single family, right? So if I look at single family real estate, listen, if I was to tell you I need to sell my home, what's the first thing you as an agent would do or suggest I would do?
Well, doing evaluation.
You look for comparables,
comparables,
right? Comparables, right? Very different when it comes to like, so let's play on that point.
Right.
You look at comparables in the area.
Yeah.
You look at what, maybe a home in my area would, or a home of my, similar to mine would have sold in the last 3 months, 6 months, et cetera. And then you would come up with your pricing or valuation, right? Very different in the multifamily space, right? Multifamily is really driven it's really driven as a business, right? It's driven by that net operating income that those buildings generate, right? So last year, even though, we were going through some of that volatility in the market that you sort of alluded to, that only helped us. And the reason being, as affordability became more of a challenge and it became more and more unaffordable for folks to just enter the real estate market. Forget from an investment perspective, just to purchase a home.
Right.
What did they ultimately have to do? If they couldn't buy a home, what did they end up doing?
Right.
They would end up renting, correct? So from a rental standpoint, our rental revenues were actually, ended up having its best year, right? Because the rental market was on fire and probably still is on fire to this point, right? So indirectly or directly, we sort of benefited from that, softening in the purchasing of real estate in the rental market, right? So, so from that standpoint, we sort of, withstood some of the volatility that we saw last year. But even beyond that, as we go and acquire a new property here at Equiton, we go in with a mandate of purchasing it for the long term, and we go in with a mandate of purchasing on a 10-year fixed rate mortgage. So if and you can go in and purchase a fixed rate mortgage and you understand what your costs are from a month to month, year to year standpoint, it's easy to go ahead and project in terms of what you can provide from a risk adjusted return to your investors, right? So you sort of hedge yourself that way as well. Right?
That's really interesting. So despite the volatility, with rents going up, you've actually been able to perform.
And the rents and the properties of the value of the properties has gone up, right? And then to that point, like we get our properties externally appraised by CBRE, which you'll recognize one of the largest commercial brokerages in the world, right? They go ahead and they do an external appraisal on a yearly basis as well as a quarterly desk appraisal to truly, ensure that our value of our fund is truly reflective of the underlying assets in the fund, right? So, and again, the values have been going up over time to the point where, 2022 was our best calendar year.
Wow. Okay. Now, if someone approaches you guys and wants to invest, a certain sum of money, what's your first, I guess, steps with them? Do you sit down with them? Do you evaluate their current assets? How do you make sure that you don't overexpose them, over leverage them, so that they're not putting all their eggs in one basket? How does that process work?
It's a very good question. So we do go through what's called the qualification process. It's an eligibility and suitability process. Okay. So we are governed by the Ontario Securities Commission, right? Myself, as a dealing representative, I am licensed with the Ontario Securities Commission. This is effectively a security, right? In order to participate in these investments, there is criteria, as you sort of alluded to. There is the eligibility criteria and there's a suitability criteria. So from an eligibility standpoint, quite honestly, anybody can invest. There is a bucket that each individual can invest. And given that our minimum is $5,000 for one of our funds, it is approachable to everyone. Okay. From a suitability standpoint, to your second point there, we do have to evaluate an individual's personal situation, right? So the first thing that I do when any investor comes to me at Equiton, I want to understand their why. Why are you investing why are you investing in passive investments, for one? Why are you looking to invest in Equiton? Why do you like real estate, et cetera, et cetera? Then I get an understanding of their situation. Are they married? Do they have children? How close are they to retirement? Like, what age group are they? How strong is their income? Where do their net financial assets sort of, fit? What is their financial picture overall, right? And understanding where they are invested currently, right? So if they've heavily concentrated themselves in the public markets, for example, then there's, an opportunity to sort of diversify themselves around some of our private investments. Now, if they were heavily concentrated in private investments, then it's another question entirely. And we sort of have to understand whether or not adding more private investments makes sense for them, right? But if if an individual was to come to me and say, I'm a non-eligible investor as one of the criteria from eligibility standpoint, but I still have 10,000. I want to invest my whole 10,000. If that's all the 10,000 they have to their name, of course, I will turn them away. Right. It's just not prudent investing, and it's not even ethical from that standpoint. Right. So
that actually is very comforting to know, because now there is credibility right? We know that the firm is going to watch over you and make sure that you don't over leverage yourselves.
Yeah. And even beyond that point, sorry to cut you off, but even beyond that point, for anyone that does invest with Equiton, I am now your dedicated investment advisor, right? So if you need to call me at any time and any day, hopefully not any time, but if you need to call me any day, you have my personal number in your phone book, in your contact list at least. You can reach out to me and I will handle your situation because I understand your situation. I was the one that onboarded you. Perfect. I recognize your financial picture, your objectives and your goals, etc. Whereas, if you were to invest in one of these public offerings or even just investing through a bank, for example, who are you calling on the weekend?
Right.
Maybe a call center, right?
Yeah.
You might be calling Daniel from Colombia for all I know.
Yeah,
right? So
no idea.
we don't know, right? So at the very least, it's a personal banking relationship is sort of what I like to compare it to. And I'm your dedicated rep on all things Equiton, basically.
And that was exactly my next question was the difference between the public and private is when it comes to private, you guys are more engaged with the client on a one-on-one basis. Yeah. So that adds a level of comfort to myself and my investors because we know we're speaking to you directly when it comes to our investment. If we have any questions, of course, we won't call you on a Sunday morning, but if need be, we will.
Maybe after F1 you can call me. I got to get through my race and then you can call me after.
Sounds good. So you talked about the minimum investment for $10,000. Yeah. Now, from my understanding, there's also one for $5,000.
Correct.
The returns are going to be different, but talk about that fund as well.
So interestingly enough, Essen, the returns on that fund is actually larger than the returns, targeted returns, I should say, on that fund are larger than the targeted returns on our residential income fund.
Got it. Okay.
So the residential income fund, we target between 8 to 12%.
And that's the $10,000.
That's the $10,000 minimum. We target 8 to 12% annualized return. Now, 6% of that gets paid out on a yearly basis in the form of monthly distributions. Right. It works very similar in our income and development fund in the sense that we're targeting a return of 12 to 16% in this fund. Okay. However, again, you're still getting that 6% annualized payment paid in monthly distributions. Okay. The difference with this second fund is where the income producing sources are coming from. Okay? Whereas the first residential fund, it's essentially a private real estate investment trust, right? A REIT. Right. Your income is being generated by the rental revenue that obviously a lot of the tenants are going to pay in the fund, as well as that capital appreciation over time, et cetera. In the income and development fund, your income sources are coming from three different places. Right. One being an investment in a commercial plaza. Yeah. Okay. The second being private lending. So private lending is effectively Equiton is playing the role of a bank. Right. They're lending money to borrowers of capital. Those borrowers of capital are now paying an interest rate. That interest payment is going down to or pushed down to our investors. Right. Right. And the final piece of that fund, and if I'm being honest, the most significant piece of that fund is the completion of development projects, okay? So we anticipate over a 10-year period, we will likely finish between 3 and 4 development projects in that fund. Yeah. And as those development projects finish, Essen, you will see a huge special distribution from those development projects. Right. And that will really drive that 12 to 16% return. Okay. Right? Which is why in that fund, if I'm being very honest, we would essentially, or I would suggest or coach my investors that it's the time that you spend in that fund that really will dictate your experience in that investment. Right. Because the more time you spend in that fund, the more you will benefit from those special distributions over time. And that fund may just outpace or outperform our residential fund.
Amazing. That's amazing. And the cash flow that we're receiving, can we redeploy that into the investment or does that still come back to us?
So you can do one of two things. You can either take that cash flow in cash, right, on a monthly basis or distribution, or you can reinvest it into the plan as part of our distribution reinvestment plan and help compound growth over time. Nice. And then take that money out whenever you so choose. In fact, most of our investors that are choosing to go the route of registered funds, it doesn't necessarily make sense for them to take it as cash. Right. So they reinvest it and compound their growth. And then, of course, you see a higher return over time. Right? Yeah.
So, now, how does these investments, how do they impact your taxes?
Yeah, that's a great question. The tax question.
A lot of questions about tax, right? So how do you address that with Equiton?
Of course, very good question when it comes to tax. So our residential income fund trust, so the first investment fund that we were talking about with the minimum $10,000, it's actually taxed as one of the most efficient tax vehicles that I know of, at least, right? So it's all of the distributions in that fund is treated as what's considered 100% return of capital for CRA purposes. Okay?
Got it.
Canada Revenue Agency purposes. Yeah. So what that really means, Essen, everything that you earn from a distribution in the year that you've earned it, you don't pay tax in the year that you've earned it. Okay, you're effectively deferring that tax to the period when you actually go and exit the fund, liquidate your position, and that's when you trigger a taxable event. Okay, so let's just assume you exit the fund in 5 years. All the distributions you've earned from that point, plus whatever profit you've earned at that point, on the appreciation rather, all of that gets taxed. And even at that point, it gets taxed at a 50% capital gains tax rate. So it doesn't get included as 100% income. So this fund was really set up and organized to really be a tax efficient, deferral mechanism and a tax efficient planning mechanism for a lot of real estate investors. Because again, as a real estate investor, or even just as a general, everyday investor, there's a lot of tax planning that goes into some of their lives, right? And so a lot of this tax planning comes down to an individual level decision making, of course, but it's nice to know that you at least have some of that, tax savings mechanisms in place. If you want to leverage them at least. Right.
So just to kind of clarify there, if you have an investment property and you're getting a rent on a monthly basis, let's just say $1,000 a month, hypothetically, at the end of the year, you're going to pay tax on that full 100%. But whereas with Equiton, with the investments or with the returns you're getting, it's going to be capital gains, so only 50% at the end.
Whereas year over year, you're not paying any tax.
Got it. So it's deferred year over year. At the end, when you liquidate the asset or the money, that return will be taxed, but only on capital gains
tax,
which is another great benefit.
I mean, I don't know about you, Hassan, but the more money I can keep in my pocket, the better for me, of course, and better for your viewers, I'm sure, right?
Absolutely. So, I mean, this is amazing. This is such a great alternative to investing when it comes to real estate. And I know I'm going to get probably the most phone calls after this episode because people are going to be asking me, like, tell me more about this. And we'll have your information as well. But was there anything that you wanted to address aside from Equiton? Like, what else are you guys doing? What's coming up in the future?
Yeah, really what we're excited about right now is, again, our in-house development project. We are truly excited about it. There are other funds that not funds. There are other firms that sort of do what we do in terms of, bringing on investors, in terms of, investing on land development and sharing profits with them. But they typically work in a structure where, they're the financier and they're partnering with a developer, right? And then together they're sort of executing on that project. Here at Equiton, with our development project, we're excited about it because we're essentially doing both in-house. We are the capital raise provider. So folks like me and my colleagues as part of the capital raise team, we're partnering with our developer, which is in-house development team, right? And we're building out this project. So what that really means is, from an investor standpoint, there's some synergies that can come into play, obviously, through the investment cycle, right? The development cycle, as you know, it can be a long and arduous process, especially here in Ontario sometimes, right? Wherever you can sort of build out some efficiencies and then just push those efficiencies down to the investor. Ultimately, the investor is benefiting, right? So that's why we're really excited about it. It is our first standalone project, as I mentioned to you, at Equiton. It's in a great area, in the east end of Scarborough, as you know well. We're excited about that project, and of course, our funds. We're ultimately still performing well in our flagship fund, the residential fund. We are getting close to that $1 billion mark in terms of assets under management. And again, our investors have been really, truly happy about their consistent returns, right? It makes 6% a year. Us may not sound like, the most, exciting return in the world. It's not, we don't overpromise and underdeliver here at Equiton, but it's that consistency that we haven't missed a return in over 80 months now, right? So it's that consistency that our investors have grown to accept and count on, really, right? So that's what we're truly excited about at Equiton. We're a growing company, as I mentioned, off air, and I think maybe even on air, I don't recall. We are out in Toronto now in the downtown core. I'm part of the downtown Toronto team. Our team was, our home office or head office is out in Burlington. So we are growing, of course, as a team and as an organization. So it's an exciting time to be on board with Equiton, basically.
And I agree with you. Slow and steady returns is the best way to go.
Absolutely.
Anytime you see 30% returns, it's not a good sign. There's no easy money out there.
Look, if you want some of those, crazy returns. Maybe you want to invest in a cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting you do, of course. Disclaimer, I'm not suggesting you do, but of course, if you're looking for the casino money, this isn't the fund for you.
I'll stick with the Equiton and
stick with traditional, slow, consistent.
Absolutely.
That's what you're looking for, then you're coming our way.
So just to wrap up our conversation, can we just recap real quickly the 3 funds you talked about, the amount you need, the returns, and just quickly what they were called?
For sure. So our first fund, our flagship fund, Residential Income Fund. So it's called the Residential Income Fund Trust, to give you the legal name. I like to call it the Residential Income Fund. It's effectively a private real estate investment trust. Your returns are generated by the monthly rental revenue that the investors are paying on those units, of course. Sorry, not investors. The tenants are paying on those units, as well as the appreciation of those buildings over time. That's all being pushed down to the investors. The targeted return on that fund is between 8 to 12%. Okay, it's a minimum $10,000 investment, and you can leverage the use of registered funds, as we spoke about. It's also one of the most tax efficient vehicles in terms of our investment offerings at Equiton. All returns or distributions are treated as 100% return of capital, right? So that's just a good tax deferral mechanism, for example, that we spoke about. That sort of sums up the Residential Income Fund Trust. We have the Income and Development Fund, okay? We can call it maybe more of a balanced fund because it gives you exposure to different asset types within real estate. So your commercial real estate, private lending, as well as development projects. That fund targets between a 12 and 16% annualized return. Again, registered fund eligible as well. And then finally, our standalone development projects. You're investing, it's not a fund, you're investing in a specific development at a specific time in a specific location. Typically tends to be our longest in terms of time horizon, right? Can be anywhere from 5+ years. Your money is locked in for those full time or duration until the end of the project, but also represents the highest return in terms of all of our offerings here at Equiton. It's a 20% annualized targeted return.
Nice. That's a great
recap. And again,
recap.
you can use registered funds as well.
Awesome. Perfect recap
there's
there.
Your recap.
That's a good recap.
At a very high level. There you go.
Awesome. So before we end this, we're going to flip the script a little bit and ask you some fun questions, non-business related.
Sure.
As Nick knows, our camera guy. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Feel free to share your stories. Sure. First question I have is, what's your favorite place to travel?
Favorite place to travel? Yeah, this might be a boring answer, to be honest. I like to, look, everyone from time to time should and probably enjoys going and sitting on a beach somewhere, having a tropical drink, whatever it is. And I'm not beyond that. I enjoy that from time to time as well. But if I'm being very honest, I enjoy going back to some of the places that I used to call home, right?
Nice.
So I grew up in the Middle East. I was born in Bahrain. Okay. I enjoy going back to Bahrain.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
Nice.
I'm from India. My family's from India. Yeah. We are from a coastal state in India by the name of Goa. Okay. Nice. I enjoy going to Goa.
Yeah.
These are places.
Nice.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm always a little biased. It's one of the best places in India, if I'm being. Well, I'm biased, but I'm being honest. I think it's the best place. I enjoy going to some of these places I used to call home.
Right.
So that would probably be the best place I would like to I typically travel, and I typically go once every 2 years anyway.
Nice.
Beyond that, again, I'm open to going anywhere in the world. It was a little difficult, obviously, to do that with the pandemic in the last few years. But I'm open to anything. I'm open to any adventure, really.
Yeah, man. Like I'm the same way because I love going back home to my home country, Pakistan, and I'm from Karachi.
Of course,
And my wife is from there as well. So
great food in Pakistan.
Food is fantastic. And the weather in the November, December time frame, like it's just fantastic. So that
I think it's important that we don't forget where we're from.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, look, both of us have made a good living here in Canada. We enjoy living in Canada. Canada has provided us with a lot. Right. But it's also nice to go home sometimes.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. Yeah, and I take my kids there as well, so they get to see the country as well. So that's a great answer. We like that a lot. Second question I have is, what's your favorite TV show or a movie that you watch over and over again?
TV show or movie. So movie, I'd say my favorite movie of all time, and I find myself watching this from time to time, is The Shawshank Redemption.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not sure if you've seen that one.
That's a classic. Yeah.
That's my all-time favorite. If I'm being honest.
I love
TV shows, I haven't had it. I don't watch a lot of TV right now. My all-time favorite shows would likely have been The Sopranos.
Okay.
Again, it's been completed now for years, but it was likely the best show that I've watched.
That's an answer we get a lot from our guests, and
Sopranos,
I haven't watched it, which is I know it's
it's just the level of acting and James Gandolfini, who's no longer with us, he passed away, but the kind of actor and sort of how he resonated on the screen is probably second to none. Wow. So it's if you like the story behind it, and if you like actors and sort of the cinematic experience behind it, I think it's one of the better shows. That goes with The Shawshank as well. It's one of the better movies. That's a
classic movie.
Classic movie, yeah.
And what's the best piece of advice you've gotten that still resonates with you till today?
Oh boy. So I mentioned I used to work in finance. One of my old mentors in finance actually told me years ago, you don't always have to be the most educated person in the room.
Right.
But there's no excuse for not being the most informed.
Wow. Okay.
Right. And ultimately, if you look at it now, and we've got these things here at our fingertips, they provide a whole lot of information, right?
Yeah.
There is no excuse for being informed,
right?
Especially given our industry, right? We're in real estate. You're helping however many clients per day.
Right.
If you're not informed on the market, there's really no excuse for it, right? And that goes for anyone in any line of work, I think.
Right.
So that sort of resonated with me, and it sort of stuck with me.
That's fantastic.
Through the years. Yeah,
that's fantastic. Way to wrap up that episode. Thanks so much for your wisdom and advice. Would love to have you on. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions for this, so you and I will be in touch. Yeah. If you enjoy this episode, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Yeah. And we'll have the information from Cosme below and Equiton's information as well. Yeah. Be sure to reach out, and we'll see you at the next episode. Thank you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you.